Hi, everybody. I am not going to go over bios of everybody here. Everybody is distinguished. Don't want to waste a lot of time. What you need to know is that every one of these panelists was there at the creation, which is not to compare Capitol Hill to the Garden of Eden. I will ask each of you the first time you talk to just say what you were doing at the time of enactment, and that'll help place it. But we're going to devote the day to universal service and Section 254 and Section 706 of the Communications Act, and the details and the implementation. But to set the scene, I think it will be helpful to start with some sort of understanding of what were the priorities at the moment, what was the legislative environment, and what were the divisions. It was not primarily a Republican-Democrat thing. It was regional and it was sectoral. And so if each of you could spend a minute or so just sort of describing the environment and who the parties were, that would be helpful. We'll start with Gina Keeney.
At the time, it's hard to believe, but there was a real feeling of bipartisanship and also a momentum for doing something. We had authorized the funding for public broadcasting, which hadn't been done for years. We had passed the 92 Act dealing with cable. The 93 legislation authorized spectrum auctions. In 93, 94, we started working on what was then thought to be the Telecom Act of 1994. We only got so far, and others were there in the room for the actual 96 Act. By the time the 96 Act was enacted, I had already moved to the Federal Communications Commission, where we took on over 100 rulemakings to implement the Act.
Let's see. Do we need? Okay, here we go.
Okay.
So as Andrew was talking, it was not always partisan, and actually, you had members on both sides of the aisle, on all sides of different industry competitive issues. I teach a class at Ole Miss now, and so they're all under the age of 22. And when I say, can y'all believe there used to be something called long distance? And they can't even fathom dividing communications into distance, local and long. But back then, the 96 Act was really driven by two primary forces: the Bell regional operating companies and the long distance industry. So think Sprint, MCI, WorldCom, AT&T, long distance. And a lot of that depended upon where they were headquartered. For example, Senator Danforth was Missouri, and Sprint, being a long distance company, he was their champion. In Mississippi, I worked for Senator Lott as his staffer on these issues. And we had WorldCom, which was an emerging long distance powerhouse from a very small rural state, but had become very successful. And so we wanted to champion our home headquartered company, or to balance with the regional Bell companies, Bell South for us, and see if we could make peace between the two competitive factions so that we could get to the larger framework of the Telecom Act. So a lot of it was driven by where the companies at the time were headquartered and this major conflict between long distance and local. Chairman Dingell on the House side was an advocate primarily because of the unions for the regional Bell operating companies. A congressman from Texas, Brooks, was on the Judiciary Committee, and he had jurisdictional fights, and he was a great champion for the long distance industry. So a lot of it was driven rural, on the universal service side versus urban, and the different competitive industries where they were headquartered and where the politics and the members lined up in defending their home interest.
Katie King?
I was Communications Counsel on the Senate Commerce Committee from Senator Pressler from South Dakota was the chairman, and our main concern was ensuring that small rural companies in those big square states would not be left behind. And so my focus was on the high-cost universal service program.
John Windhausen?
Well, thanks, Andy. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Benton for putting this event together. It's a pleasure to be here with you. A little bit of background. I worked for Senator Hollings and Senator Inouye. Senator Hollings was the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee. Senator Inouye was chairman of the Telecommunications Subcommittee on that committee. So I had a unique role on the Democratic side. I want to pause here for just a second because I want to say I was so impressed with Senator Hollings and Senator Inouye by their wisdom. But if I really wanted to be inspired, I heard and listened to Senator Markey. I mean, he is just an amazing articulate. Everything that he said from that podium was what we were trying to encapsulate in the 1996 Act. I'm not sure we always did it as well as we could have, but that was what we were trying to accomplish, all the things that he talked about. He's amazing. But Andy, your question was about the bipartisanship, and it was really true. And, you know, I worked very closely with Gina and Chip as we were putting that 1994 Act together with Senator Hollings, Senator Inouye, and Senator Danforth, Gina's boss. Together, we worked very, very closely together. We were friends as well as colleagues, and we put that S652 bill in 1994 together, had a huge amount of co-sponsors. Just to fill in a little bit of the background, that's when the E-rate program was added to, in the committee, to the Telecom Act by a vote of 10-8 in the committee. So Senator Olympia Snowe, the Republican, this was one example perhaps of not being totally bipartisan, but it was that we did succeed in Senator Snowe. Rockefeller Amendment was added to the Telecom Act in the committee markup in 1994 in September. Then we tried to bring it to the floor, and unfortunately Senator Dole, who was about to run for president, he blocked the bill from going forward. So we had to start over again in 1995, and in that election, the Gingrich revolution took over, and both Senate and the House flipped over to Republican control, and starting in January of 1995. But we had developed such a good relationship with the bipartisan negotiations going on that even though the chairman of the committees were now all Republican, they wanted to work with Democrats to get this bill done. And that's when I had the great chance to work with Katie, working for Senator Pressler, and Senator Hollings had an agreement that they wanted to work together to get this done. We had made so much progress in 1994. We wanted to continue that and get that done in 1995. And it was a real pleasure that we were able to do so.
Thank you. Okay, so let's drill down on universal service. We've already heard that. You want me to use this? Yeah. Okay. You alone. Me alone? We've already heard that the divisions here were often regional and often sectoral, different industries and so forth. And the focus was on bringing local companies into long distance companies into local, inter-carrier compensation, issues like that were the main focus of attention. And some little things can take a lot of attention. We were reminiscing, burglar alarms was a big deal for various reasons. A lot of them having to do with Congressman Dingell.
And payphones.
And payphones. So, in that context, how much of a priority was universal service? And it's useful here from a historical standpoint to realize that the precursor to Lifeline and the precursor to the High Cost Fund were pre-existing in some form under the FCC's generic authority under the Communications Act. But after the breakup of AT&T, that a lot of that was internal accounting became more difficult. And so we were really talking about transforming what had been done as an internal accounting thing for the most part into a legislative system that could work in the new environment. So how much of a priority was that? And what were the issues in that context that people debated? Do you want me to pass the mic down or not? Okay. Gina, who wants to take a crack at that? Go ahead.
Universal service, addressing universal service was a must. If you were moving toward competition, you had to address what had been implicit subsidies. That was the economic goal, economic driver. The other driver was political. The rural telephone companies were not about to have legislation pass if they weren't, trying to pick my words carefully, addressed, we'll say. Some would argue they may have been protected too much, that we should have moved on, but it was just reality. You couldn't run over them, particularly given the makeup of the Senate and the Commerce Committee in the Senate in particular. But I think there was also a sense of, of the higher purpose, which is...
You may have to turn it on.
All of them are on. I'll just talk loudly too. What was the goal of universal service was not which pocket the money went into so much as we want to have a connected electorate. We need to connect people, we need to educate people, and those were the real drivers behind universal service and the E-rate. We didn't want to have a country in which only elite people or only urban people could take advantage of the new technologies, whatever they may be.
You know, one of the interesting things about the 96 Telecom Act and the world in which we now live, almost every policymaker that was critical on the Senate side in 1996 was from a small rural state. So if you think of the world, the most advanced communications applications, internet to AI, they came from South Dakota, South Carolina, Mississippi, Missouri, Nebraska. There was something called the Farm Team that was a critical component of the Senate makeup. And as we went to the North Star, but what I'll call the Twin Peaks of the objectives of the legislation, universal service paired with competition. And there was a great fear in rural America that if you went to competitive services, that they would lose out in markets which might not provide the same type of economic incentives for the same type of services, and that universal service would be the safety net or the undergirding that would make sure that competition developed everywhere, but rural America was not left behind. And so the farm team, whatever the farm team wanted, the farm team got in the negotiations. And my work was primarily focused on the competitive provisions. But the one great thing about E-rate is that it accomplished both. It's really one of the only and best examples. Well, there are two examples in universal service that achieve both universal service of the technology or the service as well as competition. One is on the mobility side of universal service, where you were competitively neutral and that you could have multiple providers getting universal service for wireless service. And then the E-rate has been tremendous for competition, that as people built to the school or to the library, they brought competition into the neighborhoods and into the main street and the businesses. So the farm team, the small state, is the untold story of the modern age.
Senator Markey has actually answered half of the question that I had prepared here, which is helpful. Unlike Lifeline, high rate subsidy functions, which modified and modernized and adapted pre-existing functions, the E-rate was new. And I am curious, with the benefit of the history that Senator Markey has already given us, which I was going to try to run through with you guys. So it's less about who the key players were than what were the issues for and against the adoption of the E-rate. and why was it so difficult? Why did it result in some filibusters and some problems? Katie or John, you want to take that?
You want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay. So we were big supporters of the E-rate program right from the beginning, and it's essential to universal service. I mean, the concepts go hand in hand, right? Because we wanted to extend the benefits of the information age, the information economy to everybody, whether they had it at home or not. They needed it at the library, they needed it at the school, they needed it at the rural healthcare center. So when Senator Snowe and Rockefeller proposed that amendment, all the Democrats supported that. And then it's interesting, after that initial hurdle of that 10-8 vote in the committee, then it became kind of baked into everything that we did going forward. And it became more bipartisan, so that when in 1990, so that vote was in 1994. When 1995 came around and we put the new bill together, it already included the E-rate provisions right from the get-go, because there was growing support for that concept that we really want to make this bill successful. We really want to make sure it achieves our purpose of nationalizing the access to these advanced technologies for every single person in this country. And the schools and libraries and healthcare providers are the essential anchor institutions that everybody uses. Every community in this country has a school and library and healthcare facilities. So it was really vitally important that be recognized in the legislative language. And I'm looking at Jim Kohlenberger because, the Clinton administration was also a big driver of support for that provision. And that really helped to galvanize everything. And even in the signing ceremony on February 8th in the Library of Congress, Newt Gingrich talked about the value of this Telecommunications Act for enhancing knowledge in community. And Newt Gingrich later became an opponent of E-rate because of the fees that he thought were too high. But the concept he embraced, because he recognized that the access to these new advanced telecommunications technologies was the future. And we wanted to bring this future and educational achievement for everybody.
First of all, just a historical note that may help put context. The Senate debated the 96 Act in June of 1995. And as I think Katie or somebody said, we thought this was going to be the 94 Act, that we thought it was going to be the 95 Act, and it spilled over into the start of 96, which is why it's the 96 Act. So the context of that Senate debate was 1995. And one of the things that happened in June of 1995 was Senator McCain tried to strip the E-rate on the floor. What motivated that, and how did that debate play out? Does somebody want to talk to that?
This is actually another interesting story in the E-rate. So when we mark up actually the E-rate, the underlying telecom of 90, at that time 95, it was not in the base text. And Senator Snowe wanted to offer it as an amendment. And we actually negotiated a compromise that would have been much more of a limited E-rate program, much, much smaller than what it is. And Senator Dole's staffer, David Wilson, who's not here to defend himself, said, no, we oppose it all. And so Senator Snowe, being a strong woman, said, okay, I'm going to go for it all. And she paired with Senator Rockefeller. She offered it in the committee for the markup, and she won. And when she won, we went to the floor, and then Jim Kohlenberger and the forces of the White House at that time, and at that time when we got to the floor, the coalitions in support of the E-rate became so overwhelming that it really wasn't a fair or a close fight with Senator McCain when he tried to strip it from the floor. And I think the vote was pretty overwhelming.
Okay, so
the lesson there is take the compromise.
Yeah. Again, Senator, somebody, again, I can't even remember who was, alluded to the fact that there were like 100 rulemakings the FCC had to do. Gina famously had to turn off her computer at 2:00 in the morning because the power went down or something. I can't remember what that was about.
I can tell that story if you want.
Yeah, okay. Hey, what's that story?
Well, the staff was working literally around the clock at the commission. There were articles on the front page of the Post and the Wall Street Journal about the utility bills spiking at the commission. But we had an antiquated system at the commission, and we had to periodically take everything down and reboot it. So I had to send an email to staff. Computers will be going down at 3:30 a.m. You can log back in at 4:30, but you need to be off between 3:30 and 4:30 a.m. And everyone was grumbling, like, I need it then.
And part of the point of eliciting that, besides just the historical thing and a tribute to the hard work, and Blair Levin should be in the room here, I don't see him, who quarterbacked this. It was an extraordinary effort. And part of the reason this was so difficult was because on everything that was really tough, is an evolving level of telecommunication services that the Commission shall establish periodically under this section, taking into account advances in telecommunications and information technologies and services. That was an extraordinary gift, a blank check, if you will, to adapt and modernize Section 254 services as needed. I'm curious what the thinking was at the time and how you think that's played out.
Sure. Well, I was always a big advocate for giving authority to the FCC to adapt its regulations to the changing regulatory landscape, because it's very difficult to pass legislation. And I was afraid of locking in any particular technology through an act of Congress that the FCC couldn't then change or alter or just, reflect the changes in the act. There's an interesting example in the conference report. This is not the statutory language, but the report that goes along with the statutory language, where the conference report itself says that it could be that we don't need to subsidize dial tone service or touch tone service anymore, because it may be replaced by the year 2010. We expect that by the year 2010, it'll be replaced by video calling. And that's interesting, where the Congress in the report language was more visionary than the market. And, no, we still do need touch tone service to be subsidized. Don't get me wrong. But it was the idea was the right one, that we ought to plan for growth. And if something becomes wildly popular in the marketplace for some sectors, I think the language is something if a substantial majority of consumers are subscribing to this technology, then we want to make sure that everybody can have access to that technology, not only those who are so well off that they can afford to do so. And we deliberately, back to Senator Markey's comments, we deliberately took the word affordable and made that an important principle in the Telecommunications Act right from the get-go, that we didn't just want all of these new services to be available, we wanted them to be affordable so that everybody could have access to them.
I'll add an anecdote to that as to why you don't want members of Congress being too specific in legislation. The staff was left, Senator Danforth came back from meeting with a bunch of other senators, and he said there was one sticking point, and it was cohabitation. And we were like, what? Well, it was co-location of facilities.
And that was Senator Lott.
Yeah. Chip, I'm curious in the current context, because you run a trade association that deals with this on the ground every day. Has that floating concept and trying to figure out how to adapt it been important to your members?
It has, and as we've seen really in the last 10 years, much more advances both in the technologies and the networks and the services, and some of the original objectives of greater competition begin to emerge. And the flexibility that was built into the Act, I think, was pretty critical to make sure that we maintain the principle, the enduring principle of competition and universal service, while adapting and evolving to the services and the technologies. As we look at the Act and we say, okay, what are the successes? What are the surprises? And what is still to do? I think on universal service, we have in the Act the flexibility to modernize. And it's not a question of the underlying Act and the strength of it, but it's more of the political will of a commission or the Congress to actually modernize the universal service. And so that's where you have some successes and some areas of still to do.
Thank you. Anybody else on this? Okay. With the key provisions of universal service, the E-rate, Lifeline, high cost fund, health fund, are governed by Section 254 of the Act. But there's also Section 706, which relates to advanced telecommunications services. And I'm curious about the thinking at the time of adopting that provision and what underlay it. And I would note again, for this kind of political historical thing, one often hears complaints, why the 96 Act didn't even have the word internet in it. There's a reason for that. And maybe somebody can explain what that is.
I'll take the first shot. So in the House, the science, in the Senate, you have Commerce, Science, Transportation. In the House, you had the Commerce Committee and the Science Committee. And the internet at that time had not been transitioned from the government-owned, operated internet. It was still part of DOD and our research agencies and universities. It was not the commercial internet that we know today. And so the Science Committee in the House had full jurisdiction of the internet. And to avoid a cross-jurisdiction or a referral to the Science Committee, we labeled everything advanced networks. But so every time you read advanced networks in the Act, know that it means the internet and other advanced networks. The underlying untold story on 706, as we went into the negotiations starting in 95, we did something at the beginning to try to avoid being filibustered again in the Senate, and that was to have a period where we just negotiated principles. And one of the principles was technologically neutral. One principle was competitively neutral. One principle was universal service. But we had 10 different principles. And then we negotiated. That was what we did on the Republican side. And we involved every staffer on the committee. And then we negotiated with all the Democrat staffers on their principles. And then we merged common bipartisan principles. And we had a lobbyist from Corning who was lobbying for a carve-out for fiber optic networks and a preference for fiber optics. And we said, well, we can't do that because we have this principle called technology neutral. And so at the end of our negotiations on every other provision of the Act, we said, okay, we've got to take care of this guy. What can we give him? And so we negotiated Section 706 that would say, we're going to have a report on advanced networks. And I'm sure that fiber optics will be part of advanced networks. And this is how you can lobby for the rest of your life to get fiber as a preference in the COVID legislation. And that's the history of where 706 came.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And
No, she's being the BEAD Act.
no, and I think that there was a particular member of the Commerce Committee whose vote we wanted to get, and was being lobbied by Corning, and so it was partly that too. But it also, people have asked, what does Section 706 really do? And to some extent, it doesn't do anything except, it's aspirational, but it doesn't have any, actual teeth like some of the lobbyists wanted.
Well, let's pick up on that, the aspirational aspect of it. Again, this has already been touched on along the way to some degree, but there are enough people in this room who were not old enough to participate or even alive in 1996. At the time, internet access for residential purposes and small businesses was dial-up. That was it. And I don't even know if DSL was widely, or ISDN were widely available in '96. I can't recall.
It's just beginning.
Still does nothing.
Yes. But this was the dawn of the dial-up access period. So I think people often trivialize Capitol Hill and the members and staff. They don't know anything, and Ted Stevens certainly helped create that image, famously referring to the internet as a series of pipes, which wasn't entirely wrong. But certainly the staff, and I think to a greater degree than most people understand, many of the members really did understand important aspects of it, and they certainly knew what was important for their constituents. So how did the lawmakers think about this? Did they see this as writing something that was going to be incredibly important in the future? Was this just another piece of legislation, or how did the members actually think about this and approach this?
You're talking about the act as a whole, or
Yeah, the act as a whole.
Oh, it was a huge deal. It was monumental. I think a lot of the legislators recognized that at the time because you were dealing with so many components. We haven't touched, this session is focused on universal service. So that's one component of this very large bill. We also, in the legislation, we're authorizing the Bell operating companies to get into manufacturing business, into long distance service, into information services. Each of those required different degrees of separate subsidiaries to make sure they didn't cross-subsidize one service to another service. You mentioned burglar alarms, but that was true in payphones, but there are also newspaper issues. There were broadcast issues, changing, really lifting a lot of the caps on the number of broadcast stations that could be owned by one entity, and led to the consolidation of a lot of the media marketplace. There was rights of way issues, pole attachments were an issue. I had a list, which I forgot to bring with me, but it's a list of 37 different items that are contained in this Telecommunications Act, just one sentence about each one. And so it was a huge deal, and it received so much publicity. But I remember the Washington Post, after we passed the act, the thing that they focused on was Section 230 and the restrictions of the Communications Decency Act. That was the big headline for this bill, which was also in itself a huge deal, but it was buried into the Telecommunications Act. It became one of 37 different sets of provisions.
We could do an hour and a half on the weird history of Section 230 and that famous book that was brought down to the floor of the Senate. Senator Helms did that. I can't remember. With porn stuff to show them what the internet could be used for.
Senator Exon from Nebraska.
Yeah, that's what.
Gigi's remembering.
Yeah. Right. But did this, beyond sort of the massive nature of the thing and the large number of effects, did some of the members have a vision, a sense about how this really could open up things, or how this might change things?
Yeah, it depended on the member. Like Ed Markey, he had a vision. Senator Gore, Congressman Gore, Senator Gore, Vice President Gore had a vision.
I think for many of us, for Senator Lott, he had a company that was all of a sudden, having tremendous success, and a number of other cluster of telecommunication companies. And he looked at it, this is a way to bring a rural state that has struggled economically into the future. And he wanted to build ships, and he wanted to build telecommunications, and he wanted to grow his state. So for some, it was the economy, and they thought in a broad sense, this is where the future is going. And then for some, it was just preserving, whether it's the Farm Bill, the service in the rural areas and for farmers, and the Communications Decency Act, a value system as we did so.
And it did surprisingly end up that the Communications Decency Act, paired with the House language, then leads to Section 230, which then is really the foundational element of what was the catalyst for the commercial internet as we know it today.
Could we imagine in 1996 that in 1998 Google would start, or that Facebook or Twitter or X or the world in which we now live was going to emerge? No. So some of it was incomprehensible imaginations beyond what we're doing. I mean, we did reference the Jetsons, and we knew that it was possible, but those so many things that we did not expect have come out of the act. One thing that came out of the act that we didn't expect was the boom of wireless services, and then the wireless devices that we hold in our hands today. That directly came from one provision that as cell calls were being originated and terminated on the Monopoly Bell landline, there's a provision that required the FCC to do a proceeding that brought that to cost, which dramatically lowered the price and the entry of cellular and wireless. And as a result, wireless boomed in the next 3, 4, 5 years, and in many ways became the first competitor to the wireline networks and services, more than local and long distance did. So that was an unexpected benefit out of the act.
Okay, let's just kind of blue sky this a little bit. But looking back at it, I'm curious. There's lots of things we all would have liked to have done that were politically impossible. But in retrospect, with the benefit of 30 years of hindsight, are there things that you might have wanted to get into the 96 Act, particularly in the context of universal service, but also more generally, that might have been achievable, and that in retrospect would have been nice to have?
Well, the big one for me, the big disappointment in looking back, is that we didn't address the regulatory status of broadband. I mean, that led to the huge complexity and fights and legal back and forth about whether it's a telecom service or an information service. We were just on the cusp of deploying broadband. So as it was said, a lot of it was dial-up at that time, but broadband existed. It was there, but we didn't really come to terms with that. And I think if we had negotiated something, as Chip, you said, we could have come up with a lighter regulatory regime for broadband, something not Title II, but still, but also not an information service, something in between. We likely would have come to that kind of result, which would have resolved decades of litigious activity and rulemaking proceedings. So that was the big fault on our part.
There were discussions. Barry Irving here. We talked about a Title VI at some.
Title
VII, yeah.
Right. Title VII.
Yeah.
It was enough to do that. Right.
Katie, Chip, you guys have any thoughts on this?
Go ahead. And if we didn't negotiate a different title or definition, one thing that could have strengthened, similar to how we have forbearance provisions in the Act so that you can modernize the regulatory framework as markets and technologies evolve, having a
every 3 years, every 5 year forced mechanism in the Act on the modernization of USF, I think would have been helpful, because it would have brought the political pressure to bear in a process that I think would have helped us evolve USF in a better, more efficient way.
I could add it. I think having some sort of accountability every 3 years on universal service, but also on the competition provisions. A lot of things were key to when competition is there, then the bell companies can do X, Y, Z. And if that competition disappeared, they were still in the other businesses, or they still could just, instead of really competing with each other as was envisioned, they could just buy each other up and stay in their bigger regions.
All right. How much time do we have left? 15 minutes. Great. Okay, we have 15 minutes for some questions. Surely there are some questions. I will call on people if necessary.
I have a question for Jim Cole.
Okay.
Jim, as y'all were watching the House and the Senate move,
You should explain where Jim was at the time.
and Jim was in the Office of Science and Technology in the White House for Vice President Gore. He had come from Senator Cranston's staff. I was in his wedding as the Republican and blessing his marriage. We were backdoor neighbors, but share from the White House view and the vice presidential office, who was really kind of leading the effort, y'all's view of the act as it took shape.
Yeah, so we'll have that chance a little bit later. But, I mean, look, I think, for us, this was a kind of a long-term vision that was fundamentally not just about telecommunications, but about the internet and ensuring it a society of haves and have-nots. And what was, stunning to me, though, is that we had a robust policy process on our side with a lot of amazing players to help shepherd us through. And look, I think so much of this was under-anticipated in the time and underappreciated the long-term impact over time. And I think we'll get into more of this on our later panel. But, one of the things that was, we talked about the bipartisan nature of this, and like Chip and I, we, connect during this process to talk about aspects of competition and other pieces. And I think there was a robust conversation that I think everybody that on our team had come from the Hill, Greg Simon, Larry, Kristen Van Hook. And so we had a very good understanding of the Hill dynamics, and that helped us drive a good outcome.
Former Commissioner Rochelle Chong.
So looking at today's challenges, I'm wondering whether you would make suggestions to those that are looking at the AI issues, and how might you take learnings from the Telecom Act as they're considering national and state dozens and dozens of laws?
Take a stab. I think the approach of broad principles is needed, especially if you want to have bipartisan action. And I think if you're going to have regulation, this is going to be maybe a little political, but you need to have independent expert agencies in charge, agencies that feel oversight, whether from the Republican side or the Democrat side, both. If you just have agencies that are merely an extension of the executive branch, the legislative branch is not going to give them much authority.
Well, I would like to take this panel to the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House and Commerce Committee in the Senate and say, there once upon a time was bipartisan big legislation that was able to really advance the nation economically, national security, but also in a way that promoted rural and disadvantaged and everyone to have access and opportunity that comes with the technology transformations of every decade or every period. And in AI, it is such an issue of critical national purpose of winning the race, whether it's geopolitically against China or all of the amazing uses and applications that will come out of the technology. The internet policy that we shaped in the Telecom Act and really over the entire decade of the 90s, we had multiple legislation, as Gina talked about, the Cable Act, the Wireless Competitive Auctions, the 96 Act,
the Children's Safety Act, the privacy, the copyright, all of those were bipartisan in the 90s that shaped the economy we now live in. All of them tremendously bipartisan. I think it's still possible to, at some point, I hope in the near future, because we do need a national framework, not a patchwork of laws. That's one principle. But the same principles that apply to the Telecom Act apply to AI. How do we make it universally accessible? How do we preserve localism, that local communities benefit from everything, from the build of the infrastructure and the energy and the applications? And then how do we promote as much competition in the technology and the networks as possible? So there's a core group of enduring principles. I think for all of us, it's been like one of my great honors and privileges in life to have been a part of something that endured, that was sustainable and for the most part, so successful. And it's withstood the test of time. And the principles then apply now, even though the technology is different.
Yeah, I'd like to throw one additional idea on the table. I think I share some of the concerns about having a patchwork set of regulations on an AI industry that is so dynamic and so fluid right now, it's hard to pin it down. One of the other ideas that I've come across, and I don't know much about this at all, but there's this concept of a public AI network. And it occurs to me, maybe there's an alternative that would say, let's create a safe space, a safe AI service. And maybe I'll turn this to Andy a bit, because it's analogous to me to like creating public broadcasting as an alternative to the commercial broadcasting networks. And maybe public AI you could create as a way that it has safeguards, has controls, those self-generated controls, so that people wouldn't feel like their privacy is being invaded, or there's some checks on the accuracy of the information. Andy, what do you think?
This is not directly responsive, but it's partially responsive. Somebody a lot of us know, Rick Witt, has been proposing and pushing a kind of system of trust, a trusted network system that could be a safe haven, and where people could know that it was not going to be invaded or subject to various other kinds of malign influences. And that does have an AI application to what Rick has been talking about. And it's a variant on open source versus closed networks. Mm-hmm. And there are obviously pros and cons. Android has many advantages by being open source. Android has many disadvantages compared to Apple, which is closed source. So these are complicated questions. There's no good answer. And I do have to add something with respect to Rochelle's question. And this is a depressing answer. I'm curious what people think. Given the sclerotic, paralyzed Congress that we have developed for various reasons, we could talk about campaign finance, and we can talk about gerrymandering and talk about all these other kinds of things. I don't think it is conceivable to get legislation of this scope and leaving an expert agency to implement in this area. I don't think it would be possible today to come close to the kind of legislation that we got in 1996. Does anybody disagree with that?
Well, I'm ever the optimist. I think there's things that you can do on infrastructure like permitting reform that are beginning to have bipartisan consensus as you build the AI infrastructure. Private sector commitments to communities, especially as it relates to the data centers and energy and affordability. How do you, and there's, as Senator Markey, Senator Cruz, there's a bipartisan consensus beginning to emerge around
kids, the COSA and COPA. So you could begin to build piecemeal pieces of an AI framework. Nothing like the 96 Act that had, 37 elements? But that same decade was also piece by piece then it built the trust of the bipartisan consensus on the issues, especially as it related to networks and technology. It could happen again, and it's happening in pockets. Congressman Obernolte is really good on a bipartisan basis. So it is still possible. Is it likely in the next 6-8 months? Maybe not, but we're building, we're growing to it.
Andy, we got one over here.
Hi, my name is Sabrina. I'm from Alexandria, Louisiana, so I certainly appreciate somebody from Mississippi appreciating.
Yeah, we're still not getting over you taking our coach, though.
Not so caring. I started with our planning district, economic development district in 1996, coincidentally. And at that time when I started with the agency, and I'm weird, I'm still with our planning and development district. We still had a community that did not have telephone service. We currently have communities that do not have internet. So we definitely have infrastructure systems at whether it be a village or a co-op level across our entire region, including where the Mississippi River is so important to at least 40% of the U.S., don't have entity, nonprofit, so public entity, public sector or nonprofit entities that run these infrastructure systems. Digital equity, digital connectivity, or digital skills at the entity level, if they even have connectivity in their area. Thank you for what you've done. How do we get to that piece where not only are we as regions and economies and a nation looking at AI and responsibility and advanced technologies from what was done before, but how do we get to that point where we're bringing all of us up, we're jumping that divide, but we're also bringing up our skills and our functions and our responsibilities and our risk avoidance while creating that universal mindset. I like the idea of, let's involve the smart people from an apolitical standpoint to look at it, but we're still not universal 30 years later.
And one thing that I on a positive, semi-optimistic, and we'll see how it all plays out, is that the BEAD money that came out of the Infrastructure Act, which was another big bipartisan, and the Internet for All. I see Commissioner Clyburn, her father, introduced Internet for All in the House. It became the Bridge Act in the Senate. And our nation committed $42.5 billion to build to every home and business in the country.
And it's now being deployed. And Louisiana has led the way. And it hurts me to say this, but Louisiana is the best broadband office in the country. And yes, and you're about to have another round of about $21 billion that could be going into the workforce and education and the speed to build, the permitting reforms that are necessary, and hopefully the AI skill sets that can be used, that fund can help address the issues. And I hope that is implemented and executed in a way that gets us closer to the universal connectivity of advanced networks and broadband services and everything that rides on top of it and what it brings to communities. So that's something we do care about, and it has been a great bipartisan effort, and I hope one day a great success story.
Okay, John, and then anybody has any closing remarks? We got a minute or two left, so just anything else you want to add?
Sure. I just wanted to add in response to the question, our universal service work is not done. Even though we celebrate the progress we've made, we have a long way to go yet. And there are a lot of communities that don't have telephone service, even or broadband. In some places, the companies are withdrawing their copper wires and getting rid of telephone service. So you know, of that list of 37 items in the Telecom Act, about half of them are irrelevant today. But the biggest one that is still vitally important and relevant are those universal service provisions of the Telecom Act. And the Universal Service Fund is still facing this big, huge crisis, funding crisis that needs to be resolved. So it looks as if, I know this is forecasting a bit, but it looks as if in the next election, after the next election, we'll have a Republican Senate and a Democratic House. Maybe that provides the wherewithal for a bipartisan solution to come together to try to provide ongoing funding to complete the job. I see Blair Levin here, author of the National Broadband Plan in 2010, called for a lot of this to be done by the year 2020. And here we are 6 years later, we still haven't done the job. So we ought to re-energize the broadband plan, get this done over the next couple of years.
Katie, you have anything to closing remarks?
No, but just I want to thank Benton for y'all's voice in this significant conversation, and we want to continue to build to the principle of universal service. For me, the principles of competition. But y'all are a valuable, invaluable voice in this conversation.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. And we can take a short break or go right to the next panel.
To our panelists,